Just to introduce myself very briefly, I've been working here in the San Diego area since about 2008. I did a startup, which was business analytics software. And what I discovered through the process of building this startup is what I wanted to present to you today. It's basically how to take the virtualization environment that you've probably already got. Is there anyone here who doesn't have VMware or Windows virtualization or Zen or anything like that? I kind of expect that that's pretty standard nowadays. But what I wanted to cover is obviously, we started off with our startup companies just throwing some hardware in the closet. And we all know that the instant we virtualized this, it got a lot better. We took a ton of servers, threw them away, replaced old, unreliable hardware with the nice stuff. But basically, once you get through all of this, what do you really have? Obviously, you have lower maintenance costs. Obviously, you have a little bit better performance on your hardware. You probably reduced your energy usage. You're also not spending so much on individual hardware products for individual tasks. And this is the area where I started to discover a lot of interesting capability from having a virtualization infrastructure. We see all of these benefits every day, but what's a better way to think about this? I've been at a couple companies where we started off with a very plain environment. You have a couple of machines, they've got a couple of programs installed on them, and you just kind of run with it, and you just deal with the problems. But dealing with the problems is not always fun because, in addition to the fact that the hardware is old and obsolete, these applications will interfere with each other in ways that you don't really notice until there's a critical problem going on. If you run your Exchange server on the same machine that's running your QuickBooks, if you run your SQL server on the domain controller, all of a sudden you can discover that when it's time to maintain your systems, it's a lot more difficult than you think it should be. And that doesn't even begin to cover the fact that security holes will allow people to jump from application to application. If you're not an experienced Linux professional and you've got one CentOS machine which is running all of your Linux applications, you can suffer from it a lot. Obviously, the better way to do this is when you take each individual application and you run it on its own machine. And that's a lot easier when you have a virtualized infrastructure. This was an area that I discovered was really critical. Each one of these servers was completely clean, was completely dedicated, and maintaining it did not affect anything else. And there's so many cases in the past where the cost of the hardware has really made this impractical. You would say for every IT project at a small company, I would have to go out and order a tiny little server to run it on its own. Nowadays, I can tell people you're going to run this on your own environment, you're going to start it up in your own environment, and you're going to live independent from everything else. Every software program you have interferes with every other software program. When you're building a complex business process with multiple steps, every one of these steps needs to be something that you can manage and understand separately. I don't want one programmer to write a bad program and cause the entire system to go down. I'm happy for that programmer to be blamed for their own problem, but I'm not happy for them to be blamed for taking the entire email system down or the entire file server down or anything like that. And this is really something that you can do when you have a virtualized infrastructure. Keep all of your applications separate. When you have separate applications, each individual maintenance window is a breeze. Getting through this, you start to think a little bit and you say, you know what, rather than looking at this as a bank of servers, I have a bank of tasks. Every one of my processes, whether it's the nightly rebuilds, whether it's the accounting task, whether it's the email reports or the dashboard system, I like to think of each one of these things as completely independent from all of the others. If somebody needs to work on the dashboard, I don't want them to have to turn off the entire data warehousing system to work on it. I don't want them to have to shut down 3 other machines in order to gain a little bit of extra capacity to serve up a new rush of customers. And this is where, round about late 2008, I think it was, I came across a fantastic memo. This is, it's actually a little bit hard to search for, but if you go on the web and you look for the Google Amazon memo, There is a really brilliant document that was leaked accidentally by a Google Plus engineer. And what this guy said is, we're in serious trouble, we're getting beaten, every one of our competitors is faster than us, and the reason is that everything we do in this Google Plus infrastructure is not a separate API. They were suffering from the fact that all of their systems were too tightly bound together. They would use the same file system, or they would use the same database system, or they would use the same shared storage. This was making it too difficult for them to upgrade their infrastructure. And what you really need to do is to take that and separate it. Now, an interesting side effect, once I started putting this in practice at my own company, I noticed that it was much easier to get rid of the licensing fees that I was paying to everyone. You should all at this point, in 2012, you should all have a plan to phase out your licensed programs. Not all of these plans may go forward, but you always have to be looking at it. You always have to look at this and say, if I've got a product that I'm paying for and there's an open source product over here, at what point would I make the cutover? That also helps you to realize sometimes the money you pay gets you significant advantages. So what I like to do is I take my mainstream purchased paid products and I run them side by side on my private cloud with an open source equivalent. And this gives me the ability to experiment, to set up new instances very rapidly, but I can always look at this and say, is the open source product ready? Is it not ready? And in a lot of cases, I say, you know what, I'm happy to pay my licensing fees for another year because this product would be too much of a hassle for my team to maintain. But beyond that, I'm always comparing this environment. I'm always looking at two different servers to see how they perform against each other. This lets me take my disaster recovery plans and say, all right, if this machine did die today, what could I do to bring it back? Let's say a failed operating system upgrade shuts off one of my virtual machines. I would like to test spinning up a new environment. So if you can imagine a business process, I'm sorry, I don't have a good chart for this. If you can imagine a business process as one of those gigantic Visio flowcharts where you have step after step after step, you want to be able to look at each step and replace it, cycle it, upgrade it, fix it on its own. This capability really lets you monitor and manage your infrastructure better. And by the way, this is very much a side effect, but whenever you restart your environments and rebuild your machines from scratch, you get better documentation. You write down what you did, you get a cleaner install, there's less other things, less DLLs left over, fewer arcane Linux configurations. You get rid of the cruft. I find that beyond this, I love to give people free virtual machines. My team, whenever they start a new project, I tell them, you know what, just make a new VM. Do this entire task on that VM separately. I don't have to pay for this, probably because I was either using Windows Data Server, which does not charge individual license fees for individual virtual machines, or I was using Linux, where I just don't pay for it anyways. But each individual virtual machine has a dedicated task, and I encourage the programmers, I encourage the managers, the data analysts, every time they're doing something, start a new VM. Begin from scratch, begin from a known position, document it. And you know what? When you need something a little bit more complex, when you have a complex business process with 8 or 9 chained steps, you can actually create a very nice test lab. Those of you who are using VMware, you probably have incredible tools. Zen and Windows Data Center Edition are also there, but you can set up test environments with multiple machines that tie directly to each other on an isolated subnet. And in a lot of cases, I realized that what I was doing a couple of years before with my naive first-generation virtualization infrastructure, I wasn't actually doing that. I wasn't getting that set of benefits. So constantly testing disaster recovery, constantly testing my documentation, I would experiment for myself and say, can I rebuild this machine given the documentation that I have? Can I task a junior guy with recovering this system if I'm out of the country, if I'm out of the office? Make my team work a little bit faster by giving them an opportunity to practice everything. This is an area where I wanted to talk to you about a very specific benefit. I built a wiki in the very early days of my company. We were growing fast, we were hiring new people all the time. People would come to me and they would say, how do I do this? How do I start a new server? How do I spin up this program? How do I install this other thing? And I started to realize that I did not have the time to answer all of their questions. So with a wiki, you can actually just create your own documentation. I'm sure you guys have all seen Wikipedia. Maybe you haven't edited it, but Wikipedia itself is software that encourages your team to collaborate, to build new environments, and to not only that, but to write it down so that the other person who comes after you can benefit from what you did. Now, in a physical infrastructure environment, you don't think of things like this. I had physical hardware in 2004 and 2005. I had physical hardware. I did not want to spend money on something that wasn't going to be an immediate revenue driver. But when you look at this, the wiki software, which is a program called MediaWiki, has very low memory requirements. You can run it in 512 megabytes. You can run it in 1 gigabyte of RAM. Very low CPU requirements. Very low disk usage. All of this conspires to basically say, in a virtualized environment, it's 100% free. I can run it without impacting anything. I just run it using the spare capacity of one of my VMware boxes. And by doing this, I put up an environment where I could share knowledge with everyone within my company. Now, if you haven't done this, I do need to encourage you. Please give it a try. You will often find that whether your company is 10 people, 30 people, or 5,000, there's a lot of information and knowledge that is not getting from Office A to Office B. And what the wiki did for us, once we installed it, we thought it was just going to be a free place for us to write down our IP address allocations or little things like that. But what we realized is that we were starting to replace the Microsoft Word documents that people would use and just share around via email. We started to replace the online intranet pages that people would take forever to build, and then nobody would know how to update them. So we had an environment that just came in out of an incidental project through this virtualized infrastructure, and it really radically transformed our business. So think about this. Encourage your people to experiment. You never know when one guy may say, I saw an interesting open source project, I'd love to set it up here. You want to encourage that. Now, those of you who might be using like Amazon, AWS, who might be using Rackspace or one of the other cloud providers, these things do have a little bit of a cost there. But the other interesting part of it is if you have a single VMware box in your office and you have a cloud infrastructure, you can very easily move items from one place to the other. If you get a program that's really transforming your business and all of a sudden it runs out of capacity, you can take it, host it in a professional cloud. You've got this documentation. You've written down what it takes to build that server. You know what the software dependencies are. You've tested it in a disaster recovery environment. You know how to move it from place A to place B. This is another way of thinking about it. Every business process you've got has a level of refinement. Now, I used something that's kind of based off of the capability maturity model, which some of you may have seen. It was very trendy a couple of years ago, may or may not be now. But you take the CMM and you say, how good is my model? How far have I progressed? If you have a very simple business task that doesn't happen very often, it's probably just a rumor. Somebody says, oh yeah, I need to restart the Exchange server. How do I do that? Oh, well, you have to go into the server environment. People learn these things just by talking, by chatting in the hallways. On the other hand, then you get to the environment where you have a solid checklist, where you say, all right, every week when I send my backup tapes offline, what do I have to do? A good company has a nice little checklist. You tick off all the marks and you say, all right, I've accomplished the task. You get a little bit better beyond that, and you actually have detailed documentation that not only says why the checklist exists, but it also tells you here's how it could be improved on. You read the documentation in your business process and you say, I see why they did this, but you know what, things are better now. We don't have to do this manually. We can use this tool that didn't exist a year ago to replace it. So adding documentation to your checklists enables you to go in and fix them next time around. Beyond the documentation, I like to think of as the unit test environment. Those of you who've used the XP methodology for development or test-driven development will probably know some of this. Once you have a documented task, you can say, all right, how can I be sure that somebody did it correctly? And you can write a program, you can write a monitoring script, or something along those lines to verify that it actually worked. And this is where you get incredible benefits in a service-oriented architecture. You can take your unit tests and you can run them consistently to make sure that everybody is doing their tasks in a correct fashion. And not only that, once you have those tests, you spin up a virtual machine that's dedicated to doing nothing but doing tests, and now you have a service-level agreement monitor. Checks to see whether you're actually fulfilling what people think you should be fulfilling. And once you've actually done from A to verified, you have an environment that you can fully automate. You can take each individual checklist, you can write a script, you can dedicate a person or a machine to accomplishing these things, and obviously the best task, the best business process out there is no business process, is something that's fully happening without needing to be tracked, without needing to be monitored. But you've done it by building this tracking and monitoring so that you know that you can explain it, so that you know you can go back and improve on it next time around. You know, this is what I found was much more radical than my initial cost savings. I looked at my VMware infrastructure, I looked at my environment, and I said, great, I've saved a little bit of money. But then in the end, you realize that you've not only saved a little bit of money, but you've actually built something that's better than what you had before. And that's basically what I wanted to cover today.